The summons arrived on a Tuesday, the air thick with the scent of rain and regret. For Lady Seraphina of House Valerius, it was the scent of her life. The parchment, sealed with the imperious crest of the royal house, felt unnaturally heavy in her hand, a small, dense weight that promised to anchor her family to salvation or drag them into the final, crushing depths. Her home, the once proud Blackwood Manor, was already sinking. Its stones wept with a perpetual dampness, and the tapestries, depicting glorious hunts and Valerius triumphs, were faded ghosts of a former age, their threads worn thin as a deathbed whisper. Her father, a man who had loved risk more than reason, had left them with nothing but a noble name and a mountain of debt that cast a shadow over every sunrise. Seraphina, at 22, had become the quiet custodian of this elegant decay. She managed the dwindling household accounts, her fine calligraphy tracing the slow, methodical bleed of their finances. She mended linens with fingers that could have been playing the pianoforte at court, and she tended the last vestiges of her mother's rose garden, a riot of stubborn life in a landscape of decline. The roses, at least, did not know they were bankrupt. They bloomed with a defiant, fragrant courage that she tried to emulate, breathing in their scent each morning as a form of silent prayer. Her mother, Lady Alara, saw the royal seal, and her hands flew to her throat, a gesture of both hope and terror. "The prince," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing. "It can only be from the prince, Prince Alistair, the Winter Prince," a name spoken in the hushed, reverent tones reserved for tragedies and storms. He had ascended to his duties after the king's health had failed, a young regent, ruling a kingdom that seemed to hold its breath in his presence. His own story was a tapestry woven with dark threads. The beautiful, fragile wife, Princess Annalise, lost to a sudden, devastating illness years ago, leaving him with a silent, haunted daughter and a heart encased in ice. He was powerful, respected, but never, ever loved. He did not seem to require it. "Why would he summon me?" Seraphina asked, her own voice steady, a stark contrast to her mother's trembling. She smoothed the heavy parchment. The far wealthier, more influential houses were being paraded through the capital. That the prince's gaze would fall upon the forgotten, impoverished house of Valerius was unthinkable. Unless, she thought with a sudden, chilling clarity, her poverty was precisely the point. A wife with no political power of her own, no wealthy family to make demands, no alliances to complicate his rule. A wife who would be grateful. A blank slate upon which he could write his terms. The journey to the capital was a study in contrasts. She left behind the crumbling grace of Blackwood, the soft, forgiving green of the countryside, for the hard, unyielding grey of the city. The royal palace was not a thing of beauty. It was a fortress of power. Its spires like daggers against the sky, its walls thick and imposing. It was built to intimidate, not to charm, much like its current master. She was ushered through halls that echoed with the click of her worn-heeled shoes, past guards whose faces were as impassive as the stone statues that lined the corridors. There were no flowers in the urns, no warmth from the hearths. It was a place scrubbed clean of life and joy, a mausoleum of duty. She was left to wait in an antechamber that was larger than the entire ground floor of Blackwood Manor. The furniture was severe, the wood dark and polished to a mirror shine. It reflected a distorted version of herself, a pale, slender woman, in a mended but respectable blue gown, her copper hair pinned in a simple, severe knot. She looked like a wren in a cage of eagles. When the doors finally opened, she saw him. Prince Alistair stood framed in the doorway of his study, a silhouette against the light of a tall, arched window. He was taller than she had imagined, and the severity of his reputation had not prepared her for the stark, classical beauty of his features. He had a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and clean lines, with a mouth that looked as if it had never learned to smile. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sea, grey and cold and deep, and they assessed her with an unnerving, dispassionate intelligence. There was no welcome in them, no kindness, only appraisal. "Lady Seraphina," he said, His voice was like his moved to the window, his back to her. He spoke to her reflection in the dark glass. I will not waste your time with pleasantries, my lady. You are aware of your family's delicate financial position. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, laid bare on the polished desk between them. Serafina felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, the shame of it sharp and sudden. She lifted her chin. I am. And you are aware, I presume, of the pressures upon me to remarry. Again, a statement. He was a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. The kingdom's stability is paramount, Your Highness. A faint, almost imperceptible nod. Precisely. The kingdom requires a princess. My daughter requires a mother. The roles are vacant. He turned from the window, his grey eyes finally meeting hers directly. The sheer force of his gaze was like a physical blow. I am proposing to offer the position to you. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. She had suspected it, prepared for it, but the cold, transactional nature of the words still shocked her. He spoke of a wife, a princess, as one would speak of hiring a steward or a governess. You are of impeccable lineage, he continued, his voice a flat monotone, as if reciting a list of assets. Your house, though diminished, is ancient and respected. You are educated, poised, and by all accounts, possessed of a quiet and tractable nature. You bring no troublesome political entanglements. You would be suitable. Suitable. The word hung in the air, cold and sterile. He was offering her a crown, a title, a life of unimaginable wealth, and he made it sound like a sentence. In return for your service, he went on, moving to stand behind his desk, his hands resting on its surface, House Valerius will be restored. Your debts will be paid. Your ancestral home secured for your mother's lifetime. You will want for nothing in a material sense. He paused, and his eyes seemed to grow colder, if such a thing were possible. This was the heart of the matter, the terms and conditions of their contract. However, you must understand that this arrangement will be one of convenience and public duty only. I require a partner in governance, not in life. Serafina thought of her crumbling home, of her mother's frightened eyes. She thought of the alternative, a life of genteel poverty, fading into obscurity and despair. He was offering her a cage, but it was a gilded one, and it came with the keys to her family's survival. She could endure his coldness. She had been enduring the cold for years. And if I am unable to provide the kingdom with another heir? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. It was the one unspoken expectation, the one duty that went beyond mere performance. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, a shadow of pain, so fleeting she might have imagined it. The succession is secure enough for now. If it should come to that, we will perform our duty as required. But it will be only that, a duty. The clinical coldness of his words was a new kind of violation. He was mapping out the entirety of their future life together, a barren landscape of obligation and distance. And yet, within her, that stubborn, rose-like courage refused to be extinguished. She would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. She would hold up her end of this bargain, and she would find her own purpose within its rigid confines. She looked at the Winter Prince, at this man who had locked his heart in a frozen vault, and she gave a single, decisive nod. I understand the terms, Your Highness, she said, her voice clear and strong. I accept. Alistair's expression did not change. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of finality. The contract was sealed. Very well. Arrangements will be made. You will be moved into the palace tomorrow. The wedding will be in a fortnight. And that was it. No handshake, no smile, no word of welcome. He had acquired a new princess, a new mother for his child, and he turned back to the papers on his desk as if the most significant transaction of his life was now concluded and of no further interest. Serafina rose, curtsied, and walked out of the study, the heavy doors closing behind her with a sound like a tomb being sealed. She was to be a princess, but she felt more like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that would never truly be her own. Barrett the wedding was a masterpiece of statecraft and solemnity, a public spectacle, a suite of rooms in the east wing of the palace, as far as possible from the prince's own apartments. They were opulent rooms, decorated in shades of cream and gold, with furniture so fine she was almost afraid to touch it. A fire crackled in the hearth, a small, lonely pocket of warmth in the vast, chilly splendor. But they were her rooms, and hers alone. The connecting door to what would have been her husband's chambers was not only closed, but locked. The symbolism was as subtle as a portcullis. Her lady's maid, Elara, a young woman from her own village who had come with her to the capital, unpacked her meager belongings, her cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the palace. "Isn't it grand, my lady?" she whispered, holding up one of Serafina's simple wool dresses against a vast cedar-lined wardrobe. "You're a princess now." Serafina smiled, a tired, faint curving of her lips. "It would seem so, Elara." "He's very handsome, the prince," Elara continued, her romantic soul undeterred by the palpable frost of the wedding ceremony. "Though he doesn't smile much, does he?" "No, Elara, he does not." Their first dinner as husband and wife was an exercise in excruciating formality. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 30. The vast expanse of polished mahogany between them, a tangible representation of the distance Alastair had decreed. An army of silent servants moved around them, serving course after course of exquisite food that Serafina could barely taste. The silence was broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. She tried once. "The city is much larger than I am accustomed to," she offered, her voice sounding small in the great hall. Alastair looked up from his plate, his gray eyes unreadable. "Indeed." He took a sip of wine. The single word was a clear dismissal. Conversation was not part of their arrangement. She did not try again. She learned, in that first meal, the shape of her new existence, a life of observation, of endurance, of silence. She watched him, studying the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his long fingers held his wineglass, the hard line of his jaw. He was a fortress, and she had no idea what he was guarding, only that she was to be kept firmly outside its walls. The father down to the child's level. "Hello, Lily," she said, her voice soft. "My name is Serafina. It's a pleasure to meet you." The child stared at her, her expression utterly blank. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply clutched her locket and stared. "She is a quiet child," Miss Gable supplied, a note of disapproval in her tone. "Since her mother's passing, she has been difficult." Serafina saw not a difficult child, but a terrified one. A child drowning in a silent sea of grief, in a palace where emotion was forbidden. She held out a hand, not to touch, but as an offering. "That's a very beautiful locket, Lily." For the first time, the girl reacted. She flinched back, pulling the locket closer to her chest, as if Serafina had threatened to snatch it away. Her silence was a wall, thicker and more absolute than any stone in the palace. Serafina retreated, her heart aching for the small, lonely princess. This, she realized, would be a far greater challenge than enduring Alastair's coldness. This was a heart even more tightly locked than his. In the ensuing weeks, Serafina established a routine. She took her meals alone, unless there was a formal occasion that required her presence beside her husband. She learned the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, the names of the key staff, the rigid, unyielding schedule that governed their lives. She learned of the West Wing, a place no one ever went. The servants' whispers told her it had been the late Princess Annalise's. Its doors were always locked, its windows perpetually shuttered, a monument to a grief so profound it had to be quarantined. She tried every day to connect with Lily. She would visit her in the nursery, bringing her small gifts, a book of fairy tales, a brightly colored ribbon, a marzipan bird from the kitchens. Lily accepted them with the same unnerving silence, placing them aside without a flicker of interest. Serafina would sit and read to her, her voice a gentle murmur in the quiet room. Lily would listen, her gaze fixed on some distant point, her hand never leaving her locket. Serafina felt herself adrift in a sea of opulent loneliness. She was a princess, a wife, a mother, and yet she was none of those things. She was a placeholder with moss. A central fountain was dry and cracked, filled with dead leaves. It was a place of profound decay, a mirror of the sorrow that seemed to seep from the very stones of the palace. Yet, even in its ruin, she could see the ghost of its former beauty. The elegant lines of the terraces, the grace of a crumbling stone bench, and, in one sheltered corner, a single, defiant rosebush, which had somehow survived the neglect. It had produced one perfect, pale, pink blossom, a fragile spot of color in a world of gray and green decay. In that moment, standing amidst the desolation, Serafina felt a sense of purpose stir within her, for the first time since her arrival. She looked at the choked beds, the tangled thorns, the broken stone, and she did not see an ending. She saw a beginning. She would bring this place back to life. It was a small thing, a quiet act of defiance against the cold, sterile world she had entered. She would cultivate beauty in this barren land. It was the one thing she knew how to do. Here, at least, was a heart she might be able to mend. The first step was to ask permission. The thought of approaching Alistair, of requesting his approval for what he would surely see as a frivolous, pointless hobby, filled her with a familiar dread. But the image of the garden, of that one lonely rose, had taken root in her mind. She found him in his study, as always, buried in state papers. She stood before his desk, her hands clasped to stop their trembling. "Your Highness," she began, her voice formal, "I have a request." He did not look up. "Yes? I have discovered the old sunken garden on the west side of the grounds. It is in a state of disrepair. I would like your permission to restore it." This time he did look up, his grey eyes narrowed with a flicker of something she couldn't name. Surprise? Annoyance? The sunken garden! It has been left to nature for years. "I am aware," she said softly, "but it has good bones. I believe it could be beautiful again. I have some knowledge of horticulture. It would give me something to occupy my time." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were trying to see the hidden mechanics of her mind. She expected a refusal. A cold began. Each morning, after her failed attempts to connect with Lily, she would change from her stiff princess gowns into a simple, practical dress and make her way to the garden. Ilara, ever loyal, would often join her, though her own efforts were more enthusiastic than effective. At first, the work was backbreaking. She pulled weeds until her muscles ached, their stubborn roots clinging to the soil. She cleared away years of accumulated leaves and debris, uncovering forgotten stone pathways and the outlines of long-dead flower beds. It was slow, arduous work, but it was honest. In the garden, she was not Princess Serafina, the prince's convenient wife. She was just a woman with dirt under her fingernails and a clear, achievable goal. The physical exertion was a balm to her troubled mind, and the steady progress, inch by painful inch, was more satisfying than any courtly compliment. She began to bring Lily with her. She didn't ask the child to help. She simply brought a blanket and the book and set them on a patch of cleared grass. "You can sit here while I work if you like," she said gently. "The sun is warm today." For days, Lily did just that. She sat, a silent little statue in her velvet dress, clutching her locket, watching Serafina toil. Serafina didn't push. She worked, and sometimes she would talk, not to Lily directly, but to the garden itself. "Well, look at you," she'd murmur, to a struggling perennial she'd uncovered. "You've been waiting a long time for a bit of light, haven't you? We'll get you there." She spoke of the soil, of the need for water and patience, of how even the most tangled mess could be put right with care. Then, one afternoon, as Serafina was carefully untangling a thorny, overgrown climbing rose from a crumbling wall, a small shadow fell over her. Lily was standing beside her, her dark eyes fixed on the flower. She pointed a small, hesitant finger. "Pink," she whispered. The single word, the first she had ever spoken to Serafina, was so unexpected, it was like a thunderclap. Serafina froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Yes, it is," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "A very lovely pink. I think when we've cleared it away from these thorns, it will have many more flowers." Lily did not might have once been polished rosewood. As she cleaned it, she saw a single, elegant letter engraved on the silver collar where the handle met the blade. The letter A. Serafina stared at it, a strange feeling prickling her skin. A. For Alistair, or for Annalise, his late wife? The garden, she had assumed, had been abandoned after the princess's death, a place too full of memories. But this trowel felt older, more worn. It felt like a secret, a piece of a story she didn't know. Holding it in her hand, she felt a sudden, powerful connection to the history of this forgotten place. It wasn't just a garden. It was a repository of memories, of lost joys and sorrows, and she was digging them all up, one by one. She tucked the small trowel into her apron pocket, the cold metal a secret weight against her side. The mystery of the garden, and of the man who had let it die, had just deepened. The seasons began their slow turn, and with them, the garden began to awaken. Under Serafina's patient care, green shoots pushed through the dark soil. The pathways were cleared, the fountains scrubbed clean, the broken statues gently righted. The single, defiant rosebush was now a thriving cascade of pale pink blooms, its fragrance perfuming the air. Serafina had found seeds for lavender and delphinium in a forgotten potting shed, and now they grew in neat, promising rows. It was becoming a place of peace, a testament to quiet, persistent effort. Lily's transformation was just as gradual and just as profound. She was a constant presence in the garden now. She had her own small patch of earth where she grew sweet peas, her small face a study in concentration as she watered them each day. She still rarely spoke in full sentences, but she would communicate in other ways, pointing out a new bud, or bringing Serafina a particularly interesting stone she had found. One afternoon, Serafina was humming a simple folk tune as she worked. To her astonishment, Lily began to hum along, her small, reedy voice a perfect echo of the melody. The sound was so sweet, so unexpected, that it brought tears to Serafina's eyes. She had also finally seen the contents of the silver locket. Lily had opened it one day, without prompting. Estrangement. He never mentioned the garden. Serafina assumed he had forgotten about it, or that he simply did not care. But he had not forgotten. He had begun to notice things. He noticed the faint scent of damp earth and roses that sometimes clung to his wife's gowns. He noticed the smudges of dirt that occasionally appeared on the pristine palace floors, leading from a side door toward the east wing. And, most significantly, he noticed the change in his daughter. One evening, from the high window of his study that overlooked the western grounds, he saw them. Serafina was on her knees, planting something, and Lily was beside her, holding a watering can. As he watched, Lily laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but a small, bubbling sound that the wind carried up to him. He could not remember the last time he had heard his daughter laugh. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the two figures in the fading light, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring in the frozen region of his chest. It felt something like warmth. A few days later, he sought her out. It was dusk, and Serafina was finishing her work for the day, her muscles weary, but her spirit content. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel path, and looked up to see him standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart gave a nervous flutter. It was the first time he had ever come to the garden. He stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the transformed space. He took in the neat rows, the blooming roses, the clear, trickling water that now flowed in the mended fountain. His face was, as always, an unreadable mask, but Serafina thought she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his grey eyes. "You have been busy," he stated. It was not a compliment, merely an observation. "It is a rewarding endeavor," she replied, rising to her feet and brushing the dirt from her hands. He walked slowly along one of the paths, his gaze falling on a particularly fine specimen of a white rose, its petals just beginning to unfurl. "The Rosa alba," he said, his voice quiet. "My mother favored them." Serafina was taken aback. It was the first personal detail, the first mention of his own family he had ever offered her. "They are resilient," she said, "and their scent is best." Locket that Lily had, for once, left sitting on the stone bench beside her book. "She showed you the portrait?" Serafina nodded. "Yes. Her mother was..." exquisitely beautiful. A shadow passed over his features. He looked away, toward the darkening sky. Her mother, he said, his voice low and strained, loved this garden very much. Or she tried to. The words were cryptic, tinged with a bitterness that startled her. It was a small offering, a shard of his past, but it felt momentous. It was the first crack she had witnessed in his carefully constructed glacier. He had shared a piece of his history, a piece of his pain, and in doing so had acknowledged her, not just as a functionary, but as a person present in his life. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, as if angry at his own lapse in control, and then turned and walked away without another word, leaving Serafina standing alone in the twilight, the scent of white roses filling the air around her, her heart filled with a fragile, burgeoning hope. The work she was doing was not just in the soil, it was reaching far deeper than she had ever imagined. The fragile peace of their existence, the tentative truce brokered in the neutral territory of the garden, was shattered by the arrival of Duchess Isolde. She descended upon the palace like a perfumed hawk, a whirlwind of silks, jewels, and sharp, knowing smiles. As the cousin of the late Princess Annalise, she claimed a proprietary interest in both the palace and its occupants, particularly Lily. She was stunningly beautiful, with hair the color of polished jet and eyes that missed nothing, and she carried with her an air of entitlement that immediately set Serafina on edge. "My dearest Alistair," she purred upon her arrival, kissing the air beside the prince's stony cheek. "You have been neglecting your family, and this," she said, her eyes sweeping over Serafina in a cold, dismissive appraisal, "must be the new little princess. How quaint." From that moment, Isolde began a subtle but relentless campaign to undermine Serafina. She treated her with a cloying, condescending sweetness in public, calling her "my dear child," and offering unsolicited advice on everything from her wardrobe to her management of the household, always with a thinly veiled implication of her provincial clench by his sides when the Duchess spoke. It was clear there was a history between them, a deep and bitter one. But it was another locked room in the palace of his past. Isolde's true target, however, was Lily. She showered the child with extravagant gifts, overwhelming her with fawning affection that felt utterly false to Serafina. She would constantly invoke the memory of Annalise, turning the late princess into a saint of impossible perfection. Seizing, "Oh, your darling mamma would have adored this doll," she would coo, pressing a lavishly dressed porcelain figure into Lily's hands. "She had hair just like this. Not brown." The last word was accompanied by a quick, pointed glance at Serafina. She was poisoning the fragile bond Serafina had so carefully cultivated with the child, trying to turn Lily against her by making her feel disloyal to her mother's memory. The climax of Isolde's campaign came at the midsummer ball, the grandest social event of the year. The palace ballroom was a glittering sea of jewels and silk, the air thick with music and gossip. Serafina, feeling deeply out of her element, wore a simple gown of white silk, her only adornment the Valerius pearls. She stood beside Alistair, performing her role. A faint, polite smile fixed on her face, while her stomach churned with anxiety. Isolde, in a magnificent gown of crimson velvet that commanded the attention of the entire room, chose her moment perfectly. As Serafina was speaking with a foreign ambassador, the Duchess swept past, stumbling with a theatrical cry of surprise. A full glass of dark red wine arced through the air, splashing down the front of Serafina's pristine white gown in a dreadful, bloody stain. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The music faltered. All eyes were on Serafina, on the ruin of her dress. "Oh, you poor, clumsy dear!" Isolde exclaimed, her voice ringing with false sympathy that dripped with malice. "How dreadful! That simple country weave will be quite impossible to clean." She turned to the silent, watching courtiers. "It is so difficult, is it not, to step into the shoes of a woman like my cousin, Annalise. She was grace itself. She would never have been so unfortunately positioned." Absolute, broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the marble floor. He did not spare a glance for Isolde. His eyes were fixed only on Serafina. He reached her, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he took in her stricken face and the stain that marred her gown. He gently took her hand, his fingers warm and firm around hers. He lifted her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. And then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying with absolute authority in the cavernous, silent room. "You have never looked more beautiful, my dear." And then, in full view of the entire, astonished court, he leaned down and kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss, not a kiss of romance, but it was something far more potent. It was a kiss of unwavering allegiance, a firm, deliberate, and deeply protective act. It was a public declaration of his support, a shield against the vipers of the court. With that one simple gesture, he claimed her as his, silencing the gossip and annulling her humiliation in an instant. He was not just Prince Alistair, her cold husband of convenience. He was her prince, her defender. He had redeemed her. He straightened up, his arm possessively around her waist, and finally turned a glacial stare on Duchess Isolde. The look in his eyes was so utterly devoid of warmth, so full of cold, controlled fury, that the Duchess visibly paled. He had said nothing to her, but his message was unmistakable. Her reign of petty terror was over. The game was done, and she had lost. Without another word, Alistair turned and escorted a stunned, trembling Serafina from the ballroom, leaving behind a court frozen in shocked silence, and a duchess whose social standing had just been publicly executed. The air between them crackled with unspoken things, the grand doors of the ballroom closing behind them, shutting out the world, and leaving them alone in the echoing silence of the hall. The nature of their arrangement irrevocably changed. Alistair did not release her. His hand remained firmly at her waist, a warm, grounding pressure, as he led her through the silent, torchlit corridors of the palace. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The public defense, the kiss, to the late Princess Annalise. The lock turned with a grating shriek of disuse. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a gust of stale, cold air that smelled of dust, dried herbs, and a profound, lingering sadness. It was the scent of a life stopped mid-breath. Alistair took a candelabra from a nearby sconce and stepped inside, pulling her gently over the threshold with him. The wing was a ghost world. Furniture was draped in white shrouds, looming like pale specters in the flickering candlelight. Portraits on the walls were turned to face the plaster. It was a place where time had been deliberately, violently stopped. He led her through a darkened sitting room and into what must have been the late princess's bedchamber. It was a vast, beautiful room, with a tall canopy bed and a balcony that would have overlooked the sunken garden. Everything was preserved under a layer of dust, an immaculate tomb. He finally released her, moving to the center of the room. He seemed to shrink within himself, the formidable prince vanishing, replaced by a man bearing a wound so deep it had become a part of his bones. This was her world, he said, his voice rough, hollowed out. I locked it away after she was gone. I thought if I could not see it, I could perhaps forget. I was a fool. He turned to face her, his eyes dark pools of pain in the candlelight. You deserve an explanation. Not just for tonight, but for all of it. For my coldness. For the terms of our arrangement. Serafina could only nod, her own voice lost somewhere in her throat. My first wife, he began, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, was not just the delicate, tragic figure of the court's imagination. Annalise was unwell. She suffered from a melancholy of the soul that no physician could diagnose and no tonic could cure. She saw shadows where there was light, conspiracy where there was concern. She was profoundly fragile. He began to pace, the restless energy of a caged animal radiating from him. I loved her, or I tried to. But my love, my attempts to help, she saw them as a cage. My concern was control. My protection was possession. And Isolde accused me of not loving her. of wanting only to lock her away. His voice broke on the last words. He took a deep, shuddering breath before he could continue. That night, she took her own life. Here, in this room. She left a note, saying she was finally escaping her gilded cage. The confession hung in the dead air of the room, horrifying in its stark simplicity. Serafina felt a wave of profound compassion wash over her, so powerful it was physically painful. All his distance, all his icy control. It was not a lack of feeling. It was a shield. A desperate, necessary defense against a pain so immense it had threatened to annihilate him. "I found her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The guilt, the horror of it. It nearly destroyed me. And the betrayal. Not just by Annalisa, but by Isolde, who had cultivated this tragedy with her lies. I swore I would never allow that kind of emotion, that kind of vulnerability, to touch my life or my daughter's life again. I locked this wing. I locked my heart. I decided to live by duty alone. It was safer. It was the only way I knew how to protect what was left of me. And to protect Lily." He finally turned back to her, and the raw agony in his eyes was almost more than she could bear. "And then you came. I chose you because you were sensible, unconnected, safe. I gave you my cold, cruel terms, and you accepted them with a dignity I did not deserve. And you did the one thing I never expected. You began to let the light back in." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the garden. That garden. It was not Annalise's, not really. It was mine. My mother and I designed it when I was a boy. It was the one place in this palace I felt free. I showed it to Annalise when we were first married, hoping she would find peace there as I had. But she hated it. She said the walls were too high, that it was just another, prettier cage. Watching her there was painful. After she died, I let it die too. It was easier than facing the memory. Serafina's eyes widened as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. And her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, now ached for him with an intensity that stole her breath. He stood before her now, stripped of all his princely armor, his soul laid bare in the dusty, haunted room. The silence stretched between them, no longer empty, but filled with the weight of his confession. Serafina saw not a prince, but a man who had walked through fire, and was only just now learning he had survived. Her first instinct was not to offer words of pity or comfort, which she knew he would reject. Instead, she acted on a simpler, more profound impulse. She closed the small distance between them and reached out, her hand covering his. His skin was cold, but his fingers curled instinctively around hers, a drowning man grasping a lifeline. It was a simple gesture, a small point of contact, but in the context of their carefully distanced lives, it was a seismic event. He looked down at their joined hands, as if he had never seen such a thing before. When he looked back up at her, the last of his defenses seemed to crumble. The ice in his grey eyes had finally, irrevocably broken, revealing the deep, turbulent sea beneath. "I have been a coward, Serafina," he whispered, his voice raw. "I built these walls to keep the pain out, but I see now they have only served to lock me in with it. I have watched you. I have watched your quiet strength, your unwavering compassion for Lily. I have watched you create beauty from ruin. I have come to admire you more than any woman I have ever known." He raised his other hand, his touch tentative, almost fearful, as he brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers were trembling slightly. "Tonight, when I saw you standing there, so alone, so humiliated by Isolde's cruelty, I felt a rage I thought I had buried forever. The need to protect you was overwhelming. It was more than duty. It was something else. Something I had sworn I would never feel again." The air grew thick, charged with years of unspoken emotion. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on their faces, illuminating the tear that traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He was not the Winter Prince anymore. He was just Alistair, a man who was grieving and healing. Hesitant at first, a gentle, questioning pressure of his lips against hers. It was a kiss of profound vulnerability, of gratitude, of a sorrow too deep for words. Then, as she responded, her own lips softening against his, it deepened. All the loneliness, all the quiet yearning, all the months of silent observation and cautious hope poured into it. It was a kiss that spoke of second chances, of spring after a long, brutal winter. It was the first true moment of intimacy they had ever shared, a quiet, sacred promise made in a room full of ghosts that they would, together, finally let the light in. The days that followed the night in the West Wing were like the first days of a tentative spring. The oppressive chill that had permeated the palace and their marriage began to recede, replaced by a fragile, uncertain warmth. The change was subtle at first. Alistair began to take his breakfast with her and Lily, the long, polished table no longer feeling like a barrier between them. The conversations were stilted initially, revolving around Lily's lessons or the progress in the garden, but they were conversations nonetheless. The silence between them was no longer empty, but companionable. He started walking with her in the garden in the evenings. He did not say much, but he would watch her, a quiet, contemplative look in his eyes, as she pointed out the new growth on the wisteria, or explained her plans for the spring bulb planting. He asked her questions, not just about roses, but about her childhood at Blackwood Manor, about her favorite books, about her dreams, before her life had been so unceremoniously rerouted. He was learning her, not as an asset or a princess, but as Seraphina, and she, in turn, was learning him. She discovered that beneath the solemn, duty-bound exterior was a man with a dry, unexpected wit that would surface in a quiet, ironic comment that made her smile. She learned that his stern focus hid a mind of startling intelligence and curiosity. She saw the deep, fierce love he had for his daughter, a love he had previously shown only through anxious, overprotective distance, but was now learning to express with a gentle hand on Lily's head or a shared smile over her antics. Lily, sensitive as a flower to the emotional climate, blossomed in this new warmth. The change in her father was a miracle to her, seeing him most unlikely of circumstances. Duchess Isolde had been sent away the morning after the ball, banished from court in a quiet but absolute disgrace. Her poisonous presence was gone, and with it, the last shadow of Annalise's tragic influence. The court, ever attuned to the shifts in royal power, saw the prince's public defense of his new wife and the subsequent visible thawing of his demeanor. Their whispers turned from pitying gossip to respectful admiration. Princess Seraphina was no longer the provincial placeholder. She was the woman who had brought the spring back to the Winter Prince. One evening, as they sat on the stone bench in the garden, the air sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, Alistair turned to her. He took her hands in his expression serious. "Seraphina," he began, his voice low and earnest, "the arrangement we made when you first came here. It was a contract born of my fear. It was unfair to you, and it is no longer the truth of my heart. I would ask you, if you would be willing, to begin our marriage anew." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped box. "This is not a crown jewel," he said, his voice unsteady. "It is not a state treasure. It is just for you." She took the box, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue silk, was a locket. It was not the worn silver one that Lily carried, a symbol of a grief that had defined their lives for so long. This one was new, fashioned from warm yellow gold, its surface engraved with the delicate form of a blooming rose. She opened it. On one side was a miniature portrait of Alistair, but it was not the stern, forbidding prince she had first met. In this portrait, he was smiling, a small, genuine, heart-stopping smile that reached his grey eyes, turning them the color of a warm summer sky. The other side of the locket was empty, a polished, waiting gold surface. "I had hoped," he said softly, his gaze full of a vulnerable hope that made her heart ache, that you might place a portrait of yourself there, so that we might carry each other, and so that Lily and any other answering smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss, full of promise and relief, a kiss that sealed their new beginning. They were no longer two lonely people bound by a contract. They were a husband and a wife, partners in a life they would now build together, a life that promised to be as rich and beautiful as the garden they had, together, brought back from the brink of ruin. 2 years later, the palace was a different place. Laughter echoed in the halls that had once been tombs of silence. The West Wing was no longer locked. Seraphina, with Alistair's blessing, had undertaken its restoration. The shrouds were removed, the windows thrown open to the sun and air. The heavy, dark draperies were replaced with light, airy fabrics. It was no longer a place of mourning, but the heart of their home. The grand bedchamber was now a playroom for Lily and her new baby brother, Arthur, a cheerful, gurgling infant with his father's grey eyes and his mother's copper hair. The ghosts had been gently but firmly ushered out, replaced by the happy chaos of a growing family. The sunken garden was a masterpiece, famous throughout the kingdom. It was a riot of color and fragrance, from early spring to the first frost, a living testament to patience and love. Seraphina still worked in it nearly every day, but now she was often joined by her husband. Alistair found a surprising peace in the simple, honest work of tending the soil, a grounding counterpoint to the complexities of statecraft. He was no longer the winter prince. The court and his people now knew him as a wise, compassionate ruler, a man whose severity had been tempered by a deep and obvious love for his family. The dry wit Seraphina had discovered was now shared more freely, and his smile, once a shocking rarity, was now a frequent sight, especially when his eyes fell upon his wife or his children. Lily was a bright, confident girl of 8, her earlier silence a distant memory. She adored her baby brother and had inherited her mother's gift for gardening, tending her own small plot with a serious, proprietary air. The old silver locket with her mother's portrait was not discarded, but kept safely in a music box on her dressing table, a treasured memory that no longer held the weight of her entire world. She now comfortable, familiar gesture that spoke of a deep and abiding peace. He watched his daughter, a soft smile on his face. "Do you remember the first day I came here?" he asked quietly. "I saw you from my study window. You were covered in dirt, and you looked more regal than you ever had in silk and pearls." Seraphina smiled, her fingers tracing the pattern on his sleeve. "I remember being terrified you were going to tell me to stop." "I almost did," he admitted. "I was afraid. Afraid of what you were waking up in this garden, and in me." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. "Thank you, my love, for not being afraid of the ruins. Thank you for seeing the possibility of a garden where everyone else saw only weeds." She looked up at him, her heart so full of love it felt as if it might burst. "We are all just neglected gardens, Alistair," she said softly, "just waiting for someone with enough patience to help us grow toward the sun." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of contentment and forever. Lily ran over to them laughing and threw her arms around their necks, and in that perfect, golden moment, surrounded by the life they had cultivated, their love in full and glorious bloom, the quiet promise made in a dusty, haunted room, had become a vibrant, beautiful reality. Dear listener, how often do we encounter a person who seems distant, cold, or unapproachable? We see the walls they have built around their hearts and we turn away, assuming there is nothing of value behind them. We mistake the fortress for the person, the winter for the soul. The story of Seraphina and Alistair is a timeless reminder that the most formidable exteriors often guard the most fragile, wounded interiors. It speaks to the quiet, revolutionary power of compassion. Seraphina did not arrive with a battering ram to tear down Alistair's walls. She did not demand entry into the locked rooms of his heart. Instead, she simply found a neglected corner of his world and began, with quiet, patient persistence, to tend to it. She brought life back to a forgotten garden. And in doing so, she created a space where a wounded prince and a lonely child could begin to heal. Her strength was not in confrontation, but in cultivation. She understood that you cannot force a flower to bloom, a quiet act of kindness, without demanding immediate results. True, transformative love is rarely a lightning strike. More often, it is the slow, steady work of tending to another's soul, of weeding out their fears and watering their hopes. It is the courage to stay through the long winter, trusting that spring will eventually come. May we all have the wisdom to see the hidden gardens in others, and the courage to cultivate the ones within ourselves, trusting that even after the longest frost, love, in its own time, will always find a way to bloom. If this story of love, healing, and redemption touched your heart, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more tales that remind us of the enduring power of compassion. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.